here, Jesus has been talking about how things are going to be from this point on until the time comes when he comes back. We're going to see that in verse 24, he talks about his physical, glorious return to the planet Earth in a visible way. But 10 verses earlier is where we're at. We see that he talks about more Jerusalem-based things. And somewhere in the next 10 verses, he transitions to talking about, I guess, the present era to this time that's to come. And most of the disagreements have to do with where does that transfer happen. It's like if you listen to the radio or you're at a club and there's a DJ, and the DJ has one record, CD, MP3, whatever, one song playing, and then a skillful DJ kind of can transition from the one song into the other. It happens where it switches, and it definitely happens. But if you're not sure exactly where he switches, and that's the only kind of example that I can think of. Jesus talks about things that are definitely relevant for his hearers in the first century. But somewhere along the line, he begins talking about how things are going to be when he comes back in power and in glory. Well, this is kind of how prophecy works lots of times in the Bible. In Isaiah chapter 61, there's a verse that will probably sound familiar to you. Jesus read it and said that it had to do with his own ministry. He says, "The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me, because the Lord has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to those who are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of the Lord's favor." Jesus read that in, I think, Mark chapter 2. And he says, "This is fulfilled in me." The very next verse talks about more of his ministry, but not his first coming, but his second. It goes on to say, "and the day of vengeance of our God." So Jesus read that first bit and said, yes, I'm accomplishing that part now. It's in the Old Testament, where it talks about the first coming of Christ, and then kind of crossfades into his second coming. So here, he kind of does the same thing. For the sake of time, I'm not going to belabor the point with more and more Old Testament examples. But he talks about things that look like they're applying to the attack of Jerusalem that's coming. And he warns his hearers about how to preserve their life when Emperor Titus, well, soon to be Emperor, when Titus comes to Jerusalem and just kills everybody. But in that, he fades and talks about what he calls the Great Tribulation, the great period of suffering that the world has never known and will never know again, that precedes his second coming. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it ought not to be, let the reader understand, then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let the one on the housetop not go down, nor enter his house, to take anything out. And let the one who is in the field not turn back to take such a tribulation as has not been from the beginning of the creation that God created until now, and never will be. And if the Lord had not cut short the days, no human being would be saved. For the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened those days. And then if anyone says to you, "Look, here is the Christ," or "Look, there he is," do not believe it. False Christs and false prophets will arise and perform signs and wonders to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But be on guard. I have told you all things beforehand. He begins by warning them that when a certain thing happens, when this abomination of desolation takes place, he says, get out of there. Just leave. If you're like, "Oh, but my coat is in the house," he's like, "No, just leave it. Just get out of there." And many people would look to this and say, well, this talks about the sudden just destruction that came upon the city of Jerusalem as the Romans just laid waste to it. And even perhaps for those that are locked into the temple, they thought they had enough food to last them for another 4 months or something like that, but then they're just immolated. They're just burned alive. And he's like, don't wait. Don't strategize. Don't plan. Just leave. Just get out. And so perhaps this is a warning to his hearers for them to apply a few years later for the saving of themselves and of their families. Yet, that works really nice and tidy. But yet, Jesus says that there's certain things for them to look out for. He says, when this abomination of desolation takes place, that's when you gotta split. What's that about? Well, it's interesting because did you see how it says in brackets, let the reader understand? I'm like, I wish I could. This is definitely quoting back to the prophet Daniel, talking about a time that was to come when a pagan would come into the temple of God and just ruin the place. And Daniel chapter 12 talks about this. I think chapter 9 mentions it as well. So there's this prophecy of something that's going to happen very bad in the temple itself, in the very heart of the people's faith, their building, you know? So that's an interesting prophecy. And it happens. It happens in the 2nd century BC when the king of Syria, Antiochus Epiphanes, he comes in, kind of destroys the people that are there. It happens a couple times in the history of Israel. And goes into the Holy of Holies, the very center of the Jewish temple, and he sacrifices a pig in the middle of the Jewish holy place. And if you're familiar with anything at all of the Old Testament, you know pigs aren't what they're into. And spills the blood of this unclean animal inside the holiest place of them all, and then erects a statue of Zeus in there. Just saying, this is not for you. I'm claiming this. And so Daniel prophesied this, and then a couple hundred years later, Antiochus Epiphanes fulfills it. And here's where it gets complicated. Jesus, a couple hundred years later, says, when you see this thing, you should leave. So it's almost as if history is going to repeat itself yet again. So it seems as if there's some cycle where this sort of thing is to happen again. And so some Christians, some Christians, again, it's speculative because it hasn't happened yet. So people would be looking forward, not with anticipation, but looking and saying, well, Jesus said this sort of thing is to happen again. And so that's why there's a lot of attention upon the Middle East, where there's, I have to admit, fringe groups that want to rebuild the temple, even today. And many Christians would say this fits in with what Jesus is talking about, that it will be possible for the same sort of thing to happen again. In order for that to happen, a temple needs to be rebuilt. And so perhaps this is part of the big plan. Perhaps this is the abomination of desolation that Jesus is talking about. But allow me just to say, I want to humbly say, it hasn't happened yet. I'm not sure. It makes sense to me this way. There's other Christians who hold different views. But this is mine. I think it's right. Perhaps the inclusion of let the reader understand would imply that it's for later generations who aren't hearing what he's saying, but would read it later on. Perhaps for our time.